First live event on Zoom. So also welcome to our online audiences, to the public program, The Fortress of Crossed Destinies, curated by Marina Fokides, and the third event, the crossing number 3, the Chariot, entitled Europe, the Fortress of Crossed Wars. And I would like to welcome online Marina Fokides, who will give an introduction, and Vasyl Cherepanyn, who came here the day before yesterday, arrived from Kiev in Salzburg. And before I will hand over the word to Marina Fokides, I would like to introduce both Marina and Vasyl shortly. So Vasyl is the head of the Visual Cultural Research Center, an institution founded in Kiev in 2008 as a platform for collaboration among academic, artistic, and activist communities. The VCRC received the European Cultural Foundation Princess Margaret Award for Culture in 2015 and the Igor Sabel Award grant for Culture and Theory in 2018. Cherepanyn is also a co-organizer of the Kiev Biennial. Welcome, Vasyl, and welcome, Marina. Marina is a long-term collaborator of the Academy. She is a curator and writer based in Athens, where she is now joining us from. In 2014, she was appointed the head of Artistic Office in Athens and curatorial advisor for Documenta 14. She's the founder of Kunsthalle Athens and the founding director and editor-in-chief of South as a State of Mind, an arts and culture magazine. Welcome, Marina. So Marina will give us a short introduction to the program she has curated, the title, and also to the talk of Vasyl. The floor is yours.
Hello, and very nice to see you. Thank you so much, Sophie, for this introduction, for hosting the program, for working in the program together with us. And thank you, Vasyl, so much for being with us, leaving momentarily your home under extreme threat in order to exchange with us whatever can be or cannot be exchanged. As Sophie said, this is the third event of the public program, The Fortress of Crossed Destinies, which borrows its title from a 1973 book by Italo Calvino, The Castle of Crossed Destinies, in which a group of travelers meet by chance in the castle, in the heart of a forest, but are not able to speak to each other, to exchange stories with each other in the one go. They manage this only through being with each other and through a pack of tarot cards that the narrator throw for each of them. Now, this tale of Italo Calvino constitutes, in a way, a valid parable upon which to make a public program of encounter as part of an international summer academy, which is located in a historical town in Europe, in his historical fortress in Europe, amidst mountains and valleys, amidst empires and conflicts and wars, and etc., etc. And here we find ourselves, actually me from far away, but never mind, as guests in a castle of, like the guests in the castle of Calvino, under a cloud of somehow a sense of mutual untranslatability. Not because we don't know each other from before, which is the case, but not in every case, but also due to a kind of a progression of history that runs faster than we could ever imagine, and in the meantime finds us taking our own eyes and the eyes of each other with our own bare hands. Like the opening of the novel, we find ourselves in a kind of a way muted by continuous hazards, such as the everlasting processes of colonialism, a series of worldwide economic crises, the omen of the environmental crisis, the pandemic, the persistent violence in all private and public life, the successful deadly wars as we speak. And these are the times to maybe learn or unlearn or come together in fictive castles, as in Italo Calvino 70s books, or in real experimental academies like the one you find and we find ourselves in, to reflect on new possibilities of transformation or not transformation, and of our cross or not cross destinies. We are honored to have Vasyl Cherepanyn tonight with us, and I wanted just to give a small and brief story where we somehow met with Vasyl, which was on a digital platform of Documenta 14, which started in 2017 as Documenta 14 ended and continues up to now. Not so far away in the past, in October 2021, Vasyl shared the news of an international institutional alliance between Eastern European biennales to form the 2021 Kyiv Biennale, this edition. This was an excellent paradigm for new forms of international solidarity and alternative cultural solution to overcome any kind of issues that there were and troubles that there were back then in the foregrounds. By the way, can you see me? Because I lost the sign with the academy. I guess you can. Right, that's fine. So speaking of this international Kyiv biennial, the next message we had that caught our attention and this time froze our blood in the same platform after the October 21, it was on February 26, 22, when Vasyl was writing, "Please do everything possible wherever you are. Stop this disaster. Make actions, not words. We don't have another chance. Please, everything possible. Act now. We live in bomb shelters. The whole country is under attack. Denazify Putin." This was 5 months ago, and nothing much on that sort have happened. But the news on that terms is for Vasyl to share. The questions, though, remains the same. How can we reimagine the European institutional order, as Vasyl put it? Can we arrive again, if ever, at the formation of new old vocabularies that encompass a risk, but also promise new forms of solidarity and interconnectedness? Can we? I don't know. Up to Vasyl now. Thank you so much, and good night from my part from Athens.
I hope you hear me well, right? Yeah. Thank you so much, first of all, to all of you for kindly coming tonight for this talk. It's my great pleasure to be with you today. And first of all, I would like to express my indeed deep thankfulness to Marina Fokides for her kind introduction and for having me here, and also especially to Sophie Goltz for this invitation. Personally, it's really a great honor for me to be part of the Salzburg International Summer School of Fine Arts, especially being part of this great installation, because as we all know, camouflage patterns are intended to hide something, right, to cover up, which is both a typical military task as well as the purpose of the dominant ideology. Whereas, as I assume, the idea behind the School of Seeing, which is behind the Summer Academy idea and conduct, is quite the opposite, which is rather on the side of the critique of ideology, to reveal what is hidden, to make the invisible visible. So I hope that my talk will contribute to this endeavor. And like, especially with regards to what Marina was saying, that history has been approaching us faster than we imagined before. But also politically speaking, I perceive this invitation as a genuine solidarity gesture, which I really appreciate very, very much, because it's so much needed today. So thank you so much again for that. I'm sorry that I'm standing backwards, yeah. And also, before we start, I would like to express my thankfulness to the Ukrainian military, without which I just wouldn't be able to be here, obviously, and to come, and without which my country wouldn't exist, at least in the form it does exist at the moment, and without which you here in the EU, I'm sure, would be busy with totally different agenda than what we are going to discuss today in particular. As I am coming from the country which is experiencing occupation, annexation, filtration camps, deportation, and these are not metaphors, though the lexicon itself sounds like a kind of a ghost one, right? Coming from the past, this history that is approaching us. At the same time, these are the actual realities on the ground, and the very awareness of these realities kind of provides some, at least for me, some fidelity to the truth that I'm trying to follow, and that in a way allows me to speak to you on the matter today. That is also my political task, right, as a Ukrainian as well as a European and a citizen. So I decided to entitle this talk Europe, the Fortress of Crossed Wars, in line of the concept that Marina suggested for the public program as such, the Fortress of Crossed Destinies. So I basically took the same metaphor, right? Just applied it to the current political developments with regards to Europe, whose destiny or fate depends again on the war. And at the same time, we at least I'm speaking. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that I will be and am speaking from the other side of the European wall, right? Not really the same. So we somehow share the same space, but at the same time, it's not really true. From this point of view, from the Ukrainian perspective, the so-called United Europe, or whatever you call it, still behaves as if this war is somebody else's war. And there are many reasons for that. So I will try to make a couple of points as kind of a proposition for the discussion, also for tomorrow, because from 2 p.m. till 6, right, we will have a kind of a workshop or a more general discussion. So I'm here rather not to, first of all, to learn, right? We're very interested to hear your feedback and your experiences and your perceptions with regards to what is happening a bit outside the EU. The reason why I think that, well, it's perhaps pretty obvious that the United Europe, the European Union, the West in general, so-called collective West, behaves today like that, is very much kind of shaped and defined by also by political, historical, and of course ideological reasons. So first of all, I think the problem in this regard, when we talk about the fortress, about Europe as a fortress, lies in the what I would call a kind of a modus operandi of the United Europe, right, which you can also trace elsewhere. The problem here is that the dominant type of the EU governance or governmentality today is basically that I'm sure like all of us have experienced, is very much about externalizing problems, antagonisms, conflicts to the outside, which is very much about bordering conflicts, right? Pushing them to the outside in order to keep the interior safe. And as a result of this, that's basically a strategy of a typical gated community strategy, right? And as a result of this strategy of not solving conflicts, but rather bordering them, pushing to the peripheries, so-called quote-unquote peripheries, and accusing peripheries for that, as a result of this, the EU is basically surrounded by a belt of wars in its south and its east, Ukraine and Syria included, which unavoidably is being accompanied by a huge influxes of migrants and escapers from warfares. And this is very much connected also to a kind of a political lifestyle of Europe, right? That somehow something which is here as far as I can see, because again, my perspective is a bit an outside one, kind of a natural state of things, right? Kind of like the air you breathe here, a clean air. That whenever, and this political lifestyle is based on the assumption that whenever, you may take any European country you want, right? But whenever the EU is facing some ideological polarization or discontent, fear or anger, so those really strong emotions which profoundly define our lives. A typical strategy in this case is to go back to the norm, to kind of business as usual, right? To some neutrality, to consensus that can save us from those extremes. This strategy is pretty popular also in terms of elections, right? Also pretty recent ones. Consider Macron and so on. So all in all, this idea is actually focused on being kind of centrist normality and neutrality, kind of a self-satisfied bubble, which provides some illusionary protections from those extremes, from being disturbed. It's a kind of a sanctuary. So pretty often Europe indeed is functioning as a sanctuary from the unbearable, which is always taking place elsewhere, not here, somewhere else. A kind of an Elysium, right? And by the way, this is exactly the precise reason why the EU has been haunted by right-wing populism for years, and for sure will be continuously, right? And this also, like, if you go back a bit to the realities of the war, this so-called neutrality from the West or from the side of Europe also defines today a pretty typical approach, which I personally also encountered many times during recent months, but also before, from the side, not only from the side of the Western media, but also from the cultural field in Europe and elsewhere in the West. Which is also kind of some idea of protection from affective truth, from those Ukrainian voices at war, which are full of fury, pain, rage or anger. So as if the full expression of such really very strong and maybe sometimes destructive emotions deprives those who are expressing them a kind of a validity or rationality, right? So as if it's only neutrality, some neutral position, that we can judge what is happening, what is taking place somewhere else on the ground, like in Ukraine. It's again a kind of a protection from the extreme. And this was also very much felt already 8 years ago, because as you of course know, the Russian-Ukrainian war started not just on the 24th of February, but actually in the aftermath of the Maidan revolution in 2014. So it was also pretty palpable, and one could feel it also back in the day, in 2014. And just also in the context of Maidan, which was perhaps the last European revolution so far, and somehow presented a pretty big chance to the European Union for any kind of progressive renewal, because Maidan as a revolutionary event, I will also come back to that a bit later as well, but it actually, its claim to be European and the use of the EU flag, right? And in general, so somehow that revolutionary event in Ukraine dragged Europe back to its roots, like claiming democracy, justice, freedom really seriously. So people basically were dying for that and still are. But this kind of European aspect of the Maidan as a social uprising somehow was too much disturbing for Europe. So the EU wasn't basically ready to accept and to incorporate those respective revolutionary outcomes which emerged after the square occupation experience. So totally not prepared. So somehow, ironically, dying under EU flag, it was too much for the EU, right? So the European Union was rather much more comfortable when the EU flag has been burned down at numerous demonstrations in various European capitals than when people die for the revolutionary idea under the EU flag, which is also a kind of an irony of fate or of destiny. But in this regard, this war is being described in the media, but also in my communications with many institutional as well as personal colleagues in the West in various ways. Like usually it's being referred to as a kind of a war in Ukraine, right, or conflict in Ukraine. Sometimes as a Russian-Ukrainian war, but I think, though I assume you of course coming from various backgrounds, but at the same time, with regards to the Western audiences, I think it's pretty often people cannot really grasp the magnitude and the scale of what is happening now in Ukraine, but basically it's not only in Ukraine. So my main point somehow today is that what we are dealing with is not just some Ukrainian war or Russian-Ukrainian war, but we have a great European war, a great continental war of an unprecedented scale, unseen for basically for decades, right? You can only consider that basically like those simple facts which in a way depict the general framework that we found ourselves in, because the war is not only conducted on the Ukrainian territory, so predominantly it is, right? But at the same time, other countries are directly involved. Apart from Russia, of course, this is Belarus, which is the country which has been annexed by the Russian Federation and is now under military occupation as the Ukrainian East and South. But also Transnistria, which is occupied again by the Russian Federation, part of the Moldovan territory. But also Syria, by the way, because as we know, many Syrian mercenaries are also fighting on the front line from the Russian side. Also, this war is being conducted in the regions of basically 3 seas: the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Caspian Sea. Because the Black Sea, apart from the occupied Crimea and the Russian military station there, including the nuclear bombs that are placed there as well. This Black Sea region also, of course, involves Turkey, right? Romania, also Moldova, also Bulgaria, right? With regards to the Baltic Sea, we have this, as I mentioned, Belarus, which is under military occupation from the Russian side and is basically directly threatening the Baltic nation states, right? But also we can also consider here the Scandinavian countries, right? It's not by occasion that Sweden and Finland already joined the NATO, right, alliance. As for the Caspian Sea, it's a typical place from which the Russian Federation launches its fighter jets attack and bombardments of the Ukrainian land. But at the same time, this war has already totally, really profoundly redefined the whole idea of the Eastern Europe, right? As such, like the whole region, Eastern European region, is totally different today and will be totally different further on. It's basically in a way, the main question that we have to tackle nowadays, which of course doesn't have any clear answer for obvious reasons, is whether these war developments, is it a prelude or a finale, right? And this, of course, defines all the analysis including this one. At the same time, if we refer to the realities on the ground in Ukraine, it's also worth mentioning because it's somehow it's such an obvious fact that I constantly, in a way, observe the tendency to omit it because it's kind of a very uncomfortable reality, right? That we also have to acknowledge, but we are not ready, really. I mean, in general, right? So though it's very, very obvious, but it's pretty often somehow been omitted in different discussions in the global public sphere, so to say, which is the very specificity of this war. Because unlike many war conflicts of the recent decades, right, this war is not the war between two countries, and this war is also not the war between two regular armies, and this is also not the war even between the army and the insurgency, right? But this war is basically the war between one country's military against the other country's people. And this is, and those peoples, right, in another country are being denied the right to exist as such, right? From the side of the Russian aggressor. So in this sense, we may refer to this war in many ways, right? Because pretty often this war is being called the war of aggression, the war of attrition. It's obviously it's a total war. What 80 years ago was called Totalkrieg, right? Not by occasion. Indeed, great European war. And at this point, I would also like to mention several factors which somehow enabled the very context, the conditions, which in turn made this war possible in the current form as such, right? But also these factors, I believe, somehow defined in a way the optics, how the West sees this war and perceives this war, but also the very character of this war. So I claim that is basically we are dealing here with three emergencies, which defined the and made this war in a way possible, right, in the global context. So the first emergency is a military one, is a military emergency. And first of all, here I of course mean Afghanistan, what happened there last year, right? Because it was exactly this absolutely messy and horrible US withdrawal from Afghanistan and subsequent absolutely confusing and total failure, right? Western retreat accompanied with a super rapid Taliban takeover of the country, which somehow, in a way, I think that was one of the, if not Afghanistan, we wouldn't have the war in Ukraine. That's absolutely clear, right? Because this event somehow marked the failure of this Western idea of the so-called humanitarian militarism, right? This idea which first appeared in the context of the NATO intervention in the Kosovo War in 1991, right? Then it was followed afterwards by military incursions into Afghanistan and Iraq by the US. And actually, so the idea that we can further humanitarian cause by military means, right? And this withdrawal from Afghanistan actually marked the end, the failure of this idea. It's basically not by occasion that some years ago, I think it was Emmanuel Macron who conceptualized it very precisely as NATO brain death, right? So it was really a brain death of the Western military. And it was very well sensed by the Kremlin leader before conceiving this all-out war, this full-scale invasion into Ukraine. So the second aspect in this regard is, of course, health emergency. I here mean, of course, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which brought unprecedented global isolation, right, and lack of any interaction or interconnection in general, really globally, right? Because it also contributed to the state of mind, in a way, in the Kremlin and in general in the Russian Federation, right? Because now that's why we have lots of talks in the media today about Kremlin's leader health conditions, right? Because we are basically dealing with an aging dictator, right? And who has been very much isolated and distanced from everything, right? We all remember these funny settings, right? When he has been meeting with other Western leaders, these long tables and so on. This is very obvious, right? And the third aspect in this regard is, of course, climate emergency, right? Climate emergency, which has a kind of two dimensions actually here, because first of all, it's really about the consumption of fossil fuels that the EU is continuing buying, right, from the Russian side. So in that sense, the EU citizens are directly financing the Russian military machine and the continuation of the war in Ukraine, right? So I think in order to be really honest, we have to all acknowledge that people here are directly financing, well, somehow directly, right? The governments, of course, but it is the consumers who are financing this, because that's basically the main benefit from the Russian side, of course. And I wouldn't go deep into details about the weaponization of the energy crisis by the Kremlin and so on, right? But at the same time, it has another dimension, this climate emergency, because from the outside perspective, right? From the perspective of the countries who are not so much busy or obsessed with climate change as the West is, right? There is this kind of perception that it's also, so in all these aspects, just a side note, that in all these aspects we are basically dealing not just with stricto sensu political realities, but rather psychopolitical realities. Also, really psychologically speaking, it's really very important to stress that, right? So from that kind of perspective, the West is constantly either on fire or is drowning, right? So it's like a constant emergency, and it is worsening day by day. And somehow, from the outside perspective, the West has already accustomed itself to that. It got used to this constant emergency. So no surprise that there would be like another emergency, right? Like this one. So in this sense, in this sense, these are those factors that somehow created a general context that in which even the idea of such a full-scale war on the European continent became somehow conceivable as such, right, possible. But at the same time, we can refer to other aspects, right? But whatever we take, it's actually in any respect this war. That's why I'm going back to the title that I suggested, that that this war is a European war, right? That in many respects is just another proof for that. So first of all, what is really it's just the crucial point here to not just to mention but to elaborate a bit on it, that we also have to remember that in a way, like even those practices and those phenomena that we face in Ukraine on the ground, right? Somehow they sound a bit obsolete, as if because they indeed come from the 20th century in a way, or even the 19th century, right? So in this sense, I would say that it's really important to be placed for a proper analysis and understanding in between kind of the notions of the revolution and war. Right, I think that these Hannah Arendt, so to say, notions are super important in order to understand what is happening and why basically the idea of Europe or the realities of Europe are basically at stake. So first of all, what I mean here is that this war it took the form of the war, right? But in essence, in its real nature, is what we are dealing with is basically what in good old times was called a counter-revolution, right? A counter-revolution. Because, we all know that how the Kremlin is like depicting its purposes and its aims in these conditions, right? But they actually can tell whatever they want, but it's the best way to address this, to tackle this issue really directly without camouflaging, is basically to address the very political nature of the Kremlin's regime, which is par excellence counter-revolutionary. Right, the alpha and omega, so to say, of the current degraded Russian Federation regime, right, is basically the idea to prevent even a precedent of overthrowing the dictator by the people, right? So this is a kind of a basic political idea which lies in the foundations of this Kremlin regime for already 23 years. And that was actually the reason why the Kremlin smashed all the Russian opposition, right? I mean, at home. And that was the idea why the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and also Syria, of course, saving Assad, right? Just not to let this precedent be successful like it was in Ukraine. And that's basically the reason why, which explains this absolutely maniacal obsession with Ukraine, right? From the side of the Russian leader, who is like issuing articles, long articles, as a kind of a pseudo-academic, right? Writing a lot about history, somehow rationalizing this aggression. Because this obsession with Ukraine is basically, that's why he basically transformed the whole Russian Federation into a kind of an anti-Ukraine or anti-Maidan. Yeah, because this obsession is directly based in the fear of the revolution, right? In the fear of people's uprising. And this revolutionary specter has been haunting the Kremlin and the current Russian leader throughout his rule, right? Because the revolution, the very idea of the revolution, right, like what happened in Belarus or what we experienced earlier this year in January, right, was a kind of a repetition of the Ukrainian invasion in Kazakhstan. Is very much kind of the very idea is that it's the worst nightmare, right, for the current Kremlin regime. And it's also not by occasion, by the way, just another side note, that Putin also blamed Lenin in artificially creating Ukraine, right? That's also because it's pretty often, I have to say this, because it's pretty often in the West, people think that, or try to imagine that, oh, he is somehow trying to recreate the Soviet Union or like this kind of stuff, right? But at the same time, let's not forget that actually the Kremlin ideology, this Russian Welt, Ruski Mir, right, or whatever you call it, has many problems with the Soviet legacy. However paradoxically it may sound, right? Indeed, many problems because we like it or not, but the Soviet Union started with a revolutionary event, right? So the Putin's ideology may take a lot of arguments and practices from Stalin's times, from Brezhnev's times, also from Andropov's times, but never from the 20s, right? From the 1920s, never from Lenin in this regard. In this sense, all in all, right, somehow this anti-counter-revolutionary nature of this regime is so much put forward just because, basically for very simple reason, for absolutely even primitive reason. The reason is that the lack of the mechanism of the transfer of power, right? Because Putin is basically facing an impossible task, how to rule forever, right? Which is not possible. So that's why nobody knows what happens afterwards, right? When a person dies, there is no mechanism what is going to be next. So in a way, that's why I also talked about political realities, because we are dealing again with an aging tyrant or a dictator, right? Another aspect that I would like to bring on the table is that which also shows why this war is a European war, is because this war is basically the war on memory, right? On memory politics, and that's why it's very much, at least it looks like and is conducted like an reenactment of the Second World War. It's again not by occasion. And in this regard, I would just like to, because you see, it also can be applied also to Europe, right? Because nowadays we have been all sort of obsessed with this memory discourse, like memory policies and these memory studies, weaponization of history from various sides and so on. So it's not specifically a Russian phenomenon, of course not. But at the same time, let's not forget, so if you put this sort of problematics into a bigger, wider context, right, it's paradoxically enough, we have been observing this during recent years, right, this kind of paradigmatic shift towards some illusionary past, right, like most an obvious example for that is, of course, Trump's "Make America Great Again," of course, right? So towards some past which has never existed. So paradoxically, what I mean here is that this kind of memory politics has nothing to do with history, actually. It's not about, so it claims history very much, but at the same time it's anti-historical profoundly, right? It's not about how to remember, but rather how to forget. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Nietzsche who put it precisely, that what unites us is not what we remember, but what we together decided to forget, right? So in this memory politics, it's not about history, it's about kind of thanatology, right? Kind of when dead bodies of the past become political weaponry, when necropolitics rules, right? So, and this is also very much, that's why I mentioned this, connected to Europe, right? Because Europe is also very much obsessed and basically, at least in its claims, very much based and related to history, right? It emerged, the United Europe, in practical sense, emerged on the outcomes of the Second World War, right? So, but at the same time, what is also surprising from a Ukrainian perspective is basically that like it's not about Russia, but it's indeed about Europe. That a meta-political constellation that the EU in political reality is, right? Being so much obsessed with history and with the past, and very much defined by the history, by its own history and the past, including the Second World War, right? But at the same time, it has always had problems with time. It's really, you know, we were joking in 2014 in the context of Maidan that while the EU was trying to take a decision, Russia took Crimea, right? So it's really striking that Europe, that the European Union is just incapable to act ahead. It always reacts to what has already happened, right? So it just cannot act effectively in order to prevent something. It just reacts. So this kind of a reactionary, again, psychopolitically speaking, nature of the West in general also is really striking. It seems like that that the European Union cannot find proper time to react, has problems with time, with the perception of time in general, right? I think this is something that it always acts in an inappropriate manner, right? For instance, I mean, even consider this infamous Nord Stream 2 project, right? Chancellor Scholz wasn't even able to pronounce really that he was going to, that he would stop this project if the war takes place, until the war did take place, right? So only afterwards they did. But before they were so scared that even to pronounce that it was impossible. So they were like this kind of really wasting of time, right? Because it also means human lives, obviously, right? So at the same time, I think that this also explains. This also explains many European reactions that the European Union has fetishized peace as such so much that it basically repressed the realities of the war. And again, speaking psychoanalytically, when it faced the return of the repressed, it was totally incapable to tackle that, right? But at the same time, at the same time, this war, why this war is a war on memory is just, for instance, consider the very vocabulary, the lexicon which was used by the Russian aggressor. Denazification, right? Demilitarization, preventing genocide. I mean, we are not really quite aware that, I mean, for me, to be honest, it's really even physiologically hard to pronounce such words, right? I mean, I assume that in the German-speaking context, it should have been a total atrocity, but it seems that it was not, right? I mean, that it's an atrocity talk. That it's a scandal itself that these words are outside in the global public sphere and everybody is using them, that they are like memes, like, you know. But at the same time, this is just a total right, discursive failure of the West. That somehow this discourse was picked up in order to counter it, of course, but at the same time. That's why it's, I think, one of the reasons why it was stylized and conducted on a Second World War scale exactly for these reasons. Thirdly, just to be in time, I think what is really important to mention that this war is a colonial war. And I think that this is basically one of the main aspects for our further discussions, because I think this is very much connected to the European colonial and post-colonial legacy. And the paradox, because I mean, decolonization is just such a fashionable trend. Each cultural institution everywhere in the West is super busy with that. Of course, we have lots of events and conferences about that. But at the same time, the paradox about that is that colonialism in the European context has been repressed to the past and is not being applied to the present day. So somehow this kind of an inability to think in colonial terms also with regards to other parts of Europe, like the European East, right? Because Europe's East, in terms of its colonial as well as Soviet, right, legacies, complicates a very typical and fashionable division between the global North and global South, right? Because Europe's East has been long regarded as a kind of a semi-periphery within these traditional geopolitical and cultural divisions, both from the side of the Western as well as Russian metropoles, right? But at the same time, it has been experiencing imperial siege and occupation for a long time, right? And it is actually the living conditions under direct military occupation. That is something also which the West is not capable to really to consider fully. Direct military occupation, which distinguishes this colonial background in the east of Europe from, especially the post-Soviet European East, from most of other post-colonial contexts and experiences. Take Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, as well as all those numerous national republics currently under the Russian Federation control, right? Their anti-colonial struggles and deoccupation strategies are absolutely of global importance. We are just really not fully consider that. But at the same time, let's not forget that somehow in parallel, the east of Europe, especially the post-Soviet East and foremost Ukraine, has been also in the colonial focus of the Western metropoles, Berlin in particular. I would not go long back to in history, but from the 1930s, right, when Ukraine became both a central target for both Moscow and Berlin colonial strategy, up to the so-called Ostpolitik, right, pursued in the Cold War times, in the second part of the 20th century, within the framework of which actually Ukraine became a kind of a blind spot, an elephant in the room to avoid. And the funny paradox of this so-called Ostpolitik is, you know what, that is basically there is no Ost in the Ostpolitik. There is no East because it's been evaporated. There is only Moscow imperial power that the West is exclusively directing its strategies to, right? And this also applies to the recent history of the region after the crash of the Soviet Union, when the EU established the so-called Eastern Partnership, right, strategy towards quote-unquote neighborhoods, and which also it was very benefiting and comfortable for the EU in terms of supplies of various resources, fossil fuels first of all, and also foredoomed all these neighboring lands for Russian imperial grabs, right? And so basically this colonial approach is also very much present even inside the EU, because yeah, let's be clear here, I mean that it's a very typical, I mean, it's even traditional colonial approach that we have. I mean, if it's been applied to the European continent, we basically have two Europes, right? One is progressive, polished, very nice, modernized, and there is another Europe, like second-hand Europe. Barbaric Europe, under-civilized, with totalitarian remains, and so on. So that's really pretty colonial background. And okay, the last point I would like to make here is that why this war is a European war in this sense is because this war is a genocidal fascist war. Right, and this also very much, unfortunately, deals with Europe, with the United Europe, and first of all with the Western Europe, right? Because the problem is that basically that you know that somehow. What was really striking for me personally, but also politically speaking, like when this war started, is this total incapability to recognize Russian state fascism from the side of the West or from Europe's side. I think this is very much connected to inability to recognize Europe's own colonialism, right? Because the Second World War, we call it Second World War, but with regards to the east of Europe, it was basically a German colonial war, right? I mean, let's be honest about that. So, but this Russian state fascism has been so much domesticated by the Western financial and political elites that it was somehow uncomfortable to publicly denounce it, right? And it was because now we talk a lot about these right-wing authoritarian parties and populists and so on, but it was not them, it was the liberal center in the West, right? The centrists who have been pumping their assets and money into the Kremlin mafia capitalism, right? And became corrupted by it in reverse. It was under the guise of liberal democracy, right? So in this sense, that's really striking because we somehow tend to forget this because I think it's also very much connected to in a wider context, right? Because here I am really on a typical sort of say Walter Benjamin's position that behind each fascism there is a failed revolution, right? And I think that even what just not only Maidan, right, but what took place in Belarus recently, then in Kazakhstan, and even quite recently in Uzbekistan, right? It also shows that we are still living in this revolutionary sequence which started in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis, right? I mean, of course, the so-called Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Indignados in Europe, Syntagma Square, Tahrir, Maidan, I mean, you name it, right? But all these sort of global wave of square occupation movements. And surprisingly enough, you may take any context you like, but you clearly see that this revolutionary emancipative potential has been effectively, unfortunately, substituted either with right-wing authoritarianism or with warfare. Right? Ukraine and Syria, Libya, and so on included, right? So, so it's really, I mean, that's the kind of this type of dialectics, right? That it's not just took place, it did take place because something else didn't take place, right? That it was not realized because it was substituted by the alternative, right? So we can only judge about this unbelievably powerful potential of those movements when we observe those the harshness of this substitution. So my final point here, and that's why I think it's really, maybe that's why I came here in general, that I think that in all these regards, what I find really very, very dangerous, and I myself don't have, of course, an answer to that, but basically when we are trying to pose, or at least posing this question, how come that we allowed another fascist war possible on the European continent, right? In spite of all this never again and all this kitschy, right, stuff. What is really, I mean, because again, what I'm describing is basically some obvious facts, right? But at the same time, I think this sort of clear and present danger, which is just so much in front of our eyes that we are somehow kind of blinded by that, right? That's also the work of ideology, right, as we know it. So what I find really super dangerous that somehow, as we, again, this is super obvious, but somehow the European countries, not only in the EU, but also outside, right, in general, when this war was pretty obvious that it was coming, just about to start, right, somehow all of them, all Europe, right, in a way agreed in advance and accepted that another European country can be deprived of its sovereignty, of its independence, freedom, all its institutions, and Europe as such would get along with that, right? I think this was absolutely obvious after the Maidan in 2014 when Russia occupied Crimea and east of Donbass. But now it's in full scale, right? This kind of Chamberlain sort of moment, right? I think this is really very dangerous because it has in itself, it contains a kind of a domino effect, right? And I think this is very dangerous. We are just, I think the EU was of course not ready for the outcomes of this idea, of this assumption. And at the same time, now in the global public sphere, in all the even like progressive conferences and hiding behind this, so to say, ivory tower of pacifism, of non-escalation and so on, right? In its essence, basically the idea is how to secure and ensure the conditions in which it would be only Ukrainians, right, who are exposed to shelling, to bombardments, to dying, to mass rape and killing, only Ukrainians. So to contain the war within the Ukrainian borders, right? Which I find, of course, absolutely disgusting and obnoxious, right? So I think that Europe, in this sense, that's why the Fortress of Cross Wars, that is like kind of in the process of postponing the truth, still not capable of acknowledging and accepting the inevitability of what we are collectively facing these days. So, but of course, I mean, the challenge is very clear that basically, if we really seriously think about our joint future, that it's absolutely clear that you cannot trade with fascism, right? You cannot compromise with fascism. You cannot make concessions to fascism. You cannot make peace with fascism because otherwise you would be swallowed, right? So the only way to move forward is to fight it in order to win it over, right? And in this sense, I think that again, like revolution and war, right? Why I mentioned this dichotomy is that Europe or the West as such had a chance with this revolutionary wave, right? With the revolution as such, to take it as a promise and a possibility for the future. Now this chance has been lost forever. Yeah, it won't come again in this form at least. So now the only possibility is to win the war. That's the only chance, right? And that's already a super grim scenario. But at the same time, this challenge is perhaps the biggest and the most, the hardest one of today, but it will definitely shape the rest of the 21st century. I put comma here, so sorry, and I look forward to your questions and discussions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Vasyl, for this kind of thought-provoking, insightful lecture. I guess maybe if there are immediate questions, otherwise I would start with a question, but if there are immediate comments or questions, we could go right away into the discussion and clear some. If not, maybe you have one? Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I also wanted to say thank you for this very thorough lecture. There was two very interesting points that I never really thought about in terms of not just the Ukrainian war, but also war in general. Is this war, I think you said war of memories, or war against memories, but also colonialism. And I think this war on memories, I would actually argue that it's more about rewriting history rather than forgetting certain things or choosing to forget something. It's choosing what history you want to remember and fighting for this. And the US is very, very good at this. This is where I come from. They rewrite their own history in order to create an ideology in which they're fighting for, right? And I think this is definitely something that Russia is doing in rewriting its own history in order to create an ideology where Ukrainians are meant to belong in Russia, so to say. But this colonialism aspect, I think, is super interesting because Europeans are... Colonialism is always pictured as if it's global south or going from Europe to North America and South America. And going east is such an interesting topic on what is colonialism and what does that really mean and how does that kind of formulate. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to comment on that I found those 2 points very, very interesting and something to think about because colonialism is such a big topic, and a lot of people, I think a lot of scholars mistake colonialism as only Europeans going to one country, but rather it's actually expansionary ideology which goes into rewriting history as well. So I just wanted to thank you for those points, and if you had any further comments on it, that would be great too.
Yeah, shall we collect? No. Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you for this. It's a wonderful comment. Yeah, I totally agree. It's I think that one of the problems behind that is that colonialism, especially in Western Europe, right, but also elsewhere, has been very much the idea of colonialism has been very much defined by the history of maritime empires, right. So, but also has been also very much dependent on the idea of the color or a shade of skin. Right, but at the same time, there is a kind of a constant incapability to recognize colonial experiences, so to say, next to your nose, right? Just because that was actually behind actually the frustration of not being able to pursue such colonial endeavors elsewhere. Of course, there were some, I mean, from the German side, but it was exactly that was feeding the idea of National Socialism, right? It's not the same, but actually, with regards to, for instance, like German colonialism or Russian colonialism, these are continental ones, right? So they don't depend on these maritime travels and exploiting people of other. Though in Russia, it's of course so many peoples, right, who are now part of the Russian Federation. But the problem is that it's kind of framed as conceptually framed as a kind of an internal colonization. So first you occupy something, then you claim that it's mine, it's internal. So I colonize myself in a way. That's the idea which was behind Nazism and Russian expansionism as well, right? So as if there is no outside for these continental colonialist concepts, right? Like Putin himself once mentioned that Russian borders never end. They have no limits. Right, so it's just like constant sort of swallowing of other, like, and grabbing other lands and so on. So this idea of no outside. And at the same time, I think, you know, also it's kind of a personally I feel this really strange, because pretty often, again, in the West, now it's a major trend, and also in the cultural field, so many institutions are pursuing that. But at the same time, what I really find like a bit kind of what I'm puzzled with, rather, is that somehow those respective institutions or contexts are somehow so much obsessed with their own colonialism that they are just incapable to apply the same standards and the same ideas to the countries next to them, even. You know, for instance, I mean, even really very practically, pretty often, for instance, in Germany, but also it was sometimes also in Austria, but for instance, when a person from Ukraine, myself included, is invited to take part in some discussion, it had been before, especially before this full-scale war, had been pretty often the case, right? So it's usually that, oh, we have to also to find somebody from also from Russia. Right. The same is. I think that my colleagues will confirm that the same has been taking place with regards to the participants from Belarus. That you have to sort of to find another person from Russia in this case, just to balance, to have a balancing, right, kind of, so that not just one perspective dominates. Just it would be the same as if like I would be sort of inviting people from Algeria to the Kyiv Biennial, and also saying, oh, you know, guys, I also have to invite somebody from Paris just to balance you a bit, you know. Or like inviting somebody from Indonesia, saying, no, we should also have some Dutch people as well, you know. So, and it's super simple. I mean, it's like a very practical, but at the same time, this always works. This total inability to apply the same standards that you apply to yourself, just to your neighbor, right? So I think this is one of the reasons that thank you for that. This eastward sort of colonialism is, of course, I think this is what has to be considered if we really aim to analyze this properly.
Vasyl, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. In the Western news, in Europe and the States, reading newspapers, Guardian and New York Times, Al Jazeera. I'm going to go to the point. Noam Chomsky was the biggest voice of one of the most intellectuals speaking about the war. And he very much spoke about the cause of the USA, let's say not USA, contemporary history, and the role of the USA in this history. And in all his talks, he was very much accusing America of being one of the countries really starting the war. After a long time ago, a lot of Ukrainian intellectuals, I don't know if you know, like professors from Berkeley and MIT, whatever, they wrote an article a statement to Mr. Chomsky saying, Mr. Chomsky, please stop accusing only United States about this war, but please study our history a little bit better. So if you can a little bit, because I understand all the weakness, the European community, and as Anna Applebaum, the Polish art historian, writes, like Europe is the borders of Europe, they lay one on the top of each other, but all these layers, they don't lay nicely on the top of each other. And we see the last years how weak European community gets and how less opinion has. Also, we see how China is behind, stays on the side of Russia, India stays on the side of Russia. And you talk about the Second World War, which of course was started from Europe. Can you please give us a little bit, how do you see the global extension? Because we talk about a very geopolitical, world for the moment. Can you please tell us a little bit about how do you feel about the position of these powerful countries like the States and China for the moment? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. A bunch of wonderful questions. So first of all, with regards to Noam Chomsky, but for that matter also, I don't know, many others like Yanis Varoufakis, right, and so on and so on. Well, I perceive this honestly as a kind of political narcissism, right? And I think, well, now it's usually called with another fashionable word, which is West-splaining, right? But I think it's really, their arguments are really very funny in the sense that, they are so much full with kind of colonial or post-colonial thinking themselves that basically they cannot even allow the others to be the main evil. It should be always US, of course. I mean, this is the NATO, this is the main threat. And if something changes, they cannot allow this. They don't actually follow realities, right? They have been used to these kind of accusations for many years, if not decades, right? If we consider Chomsky, with all the respect to his age. But I mean that we cannot allow that it can be like another country that occupies this place of the main international criminal, or like so it should be always yes. At the same time, so I mean, it's of course overestimating and exaggeration. At the same time, I also don't buy these kind of so-called geopolitical talks. These are, though they sound really big. It's about geopolitics, but at the same time, I think political really, because I think it's important to think politically, really seriously, not just playing around, but think politically, right? I mean, and I think that this geopolitics as a discourse is very much what is usually called a kind of a small talk, right? I mean, it's not a type of political thinking for very obvious reasons, also for like the idea of colonialism as well, because it's simply deprives the agency, the subjectivity of those repressed, right? It should be always some big powers, like, and then you do some like math. Yeah, these powers are there, and yeah, of course they are like competing, and what is in between? Let's forget about that. It just doesn't exist. The main powers. These are so. It's like a kind of for me, I don't perceive it as a kind of a political discourse, right? As such, it's a kind of an exercise in self-satisfaction, if I may put it this way. But at the same time, this very much also, like what you asked about some global extensions. This very much, yeah, because of course I don't know, but. Implies and affects the realities, because even, for instance, with regards to this constant foot dragging in relation to the proper supply of the weaponry to Ukraine, right? So it's on the surface, it's being covered up with the discourse of non-escalation, because we don't know what this guy in the Kremlin is thinking, that maybe he's considering something else, and there is also kind of a perverse hidden admiration of the inner world of Putin, right, in the West, like that they are so shocked that they are at the same time amazed, which I think is just funny, right? I mean, but at the same time, like this discourse of non-escalation, not to provoke, right, to avoid improvements, but it's a cover for just a colonial approach, actually, in reality, right? Because as we know, it is as those who had been colonized they lack agency and subjectivity, so they are not supposed to defend themselves. It's only the colonizers who have this right, the powerful who have the right to possess weaponry, to conduct wars, but not some minor colonized, right? These are nothing. They just have to obey. So at the same time, this is also, which is very typical also, I mean, it also can be applied easily to the US history in terms of Black Americans movement and I mean, stuff like that, LGBTQ or whatever, I mean, so each, whoever has an agency or subjectivity has all the rights, including the military ones. So I think that pretty often this geopolitics and this kind of Chomsky-style judging about the war is just, well, I think it's really, I mean, sociologically speaking, I think Pierre Bourdieu would be applicable to them, right? I mean, they are thinking about their skin, how to find a safe place for their worldview further on, because it has been ruined at the very end, right? It didn't work out and it doesn't work out. And yeah, and on a personal level, I mean, how should I put it? Who do you think you are, Mr. Big Star, you know? I mean, people who don't speak languages, who are totally not acquainted with the context, who have never been there, they are just lecturing others what is to be done, whom to join. This is ridiculous. It's an anecdote. I don't take it seriously, of course, no. Thank you.
Thank you again. First of all, I very much agree with what you said about your kind of living and building on its ideas of the past and its memory of itself. I can mostly speak for the Dutch context, as I'm from the Netherlands, but we very much fetishize our own past and like look at, like during the summer we all walk through ruins and pay for it, and you know, like the only thing we want to see is the past and an authentic European past, and I very much agree with that. At the same time, I can sort of help but think about Ukraine, who has only been, well, independent, I don't think it's a good word, but like, well, since, let's say, the end of the Cold War has been Ukraine, and like had to build an identity, which already had, but very much reaffirmed that, maybe also build on some sort of memory of itself. And I'm thinking how, as artists, because most of us here identify as artists, how do we sort of deal with that? We have to challenge that whole idea of building on a past that maybe is not, maybe that's not the way forward. And without asking you, like, how should we behave as artists in a world, like in a wartime, or as European artists, how do we sort of do that? Because in the institutions that we also have in Europe, like the museums, you know, that we visit, the national museums, we all sort of praise this past. Are these still the right spaces to sort of deal with the issues that you just brought up, let's say colonialism, this whole sort of, this obsession with the past, or do we need new spaces? And obviously it's not for you to tell what as artists we should do, but, and also a whole other question maybe is art still something we should be occupied with in terrible times of war? But I was just wondering how you sort of envision that, because we are here at the summer school of applied art.
Yeah, it's your rule, yeah, as you say, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, too much sense, yeah. Right. I just came to my mind that basically the Netherlands, in the context of the Second World War that you also mentioned, the country, as you know better than I do, stayed neutral even 1939 after the Second World War started. So the Netherlands stayed neutral until they were occupied, right? Yeah. This is something, I mean, to consider also for today, right, I think. But I don't, so yeah, I somehow agree with the premise of your question that this obsession and building on the past is something that emerged after as an outcome of the Cold War, in a way, because basically, you know, I think in this sense, I do believe in, so in this sense also politically speaking, I am an institutionalist, so I do believe in the need of the new institutions as well as continuation of the current ones and making them as much political as possible, but not just like a fashion, right? Not just in a safe space of a white cube gallery place. But I also think that, you know, so in this sense, I think art as such and art institutions in general can indeed contribute a lot. Also during such challenging, under such challenging conditions, because basically let's not forget that this obsession with the past emerged again as not in the outcome of the Cold War, but at the same time in order to, it was enabled by the rejection of the future as an idea, right? This even that what we discussed about this shift towards some illusionary past is just because you cannot count on the future, right? It just doesn't make sense. Like again, what all these square occupation movements, they in a way presented some vision for the future, right? Some utopia. And when you're obsessed with the past, you don't need utopias. It's rather dystopian, right, type of thinking that you just you are based on the politics of kind of a ressentiment, right, which is defined by regression and repression, right, of any emancipative potential. So at the same time, I think, especially in the wars and times in these semi-peripheral or peripheral countries, I think art field as such plays a huge role, and it's super important to be sustained and even improved in this sense, because you know, especially when you are threatened by this colonial war, or on the one hand, at the same time you have so many other threats, like right-wingers, right, or different authoritarian tendencies. Also, the vulnerability of the civic realm and in general of the public sphere, right? Hardening of borders and so on and so forth. Under such conditions, pretty often, and also I'm speaking here like from the point of view of my institution too, is that it's really pretty often it's even hard to find this proper space for an adequate political expression even in the educational field, because they are very much dependent on the government bureaucracy and so on, and on the universities. That's also somehow mirroring the fate of the institutions that I'm running. But so it's pretty often some independent and autonomous art spaces that are providing that you basically have the possibility to do that. And this is so much valuable. It's not just, I'm not saying just to you this just because, you know, that, oh, you in the West, you have to be aware of what you already have, just to evaluate that and appreciate that and so on. It's just that the problem is in the West, the art field has been actually functioning in the way that even very radical transgressive gestures were easily swallowed up, right, and somehow deprived of their radicality, because they don't have any consequences in the and direct political outcomes. People come and go, like see exhibitions, right? I mean, it's just a show. But at the same time, you can have the same sort of matrix of activities, but in a bit different context, and you can see that that basically for instance, in Ukraine, the art field is not structured the way it is in the West, of course, right? Because we don't have, that's why I'm speaking about institutions, so that's why I appreciate that you mentioned institutions as well. Because you basically, as a field, was supposed to be an autonomous field, right? You don't have a kind of a buffer zone, an institutional skeleton which protects the art field from any kind of intervention from the outside. So you are constantly exposed, whatever you do. What here would be considered as some boring liberal shit in Ukraine would be some super radical communist stuff, you know, some radical claims. So I mean that it's just, it depends on the context, but at the same time I think that, you know, when, it's also because now it's also very, what you ask is very also super important because we also have this trend in Poland, right? Also in, for instance, in Hungary as well, when art institutions are being hijacked and open right-wingers are being appointed as chiefs or directors of those respective institutions. So, but what I mean here is that basically when it comes to the cultural field, it's already a sign that it's too late. Right, that if it already approached the cultural field, it means that something very progressive, emancipative, and important has been missed in the political field, in the general social field as such, right? And I think that pretty often in the West, they are being awakened when it's already about themselves, right? When it just came in front of your eyes. But they are not considering these signals in the dark, so to say, that they are approaching you, because you know, I think that it's also very important for the Western art institutions not to be afraid so to say, to reach out to this outside of which is much more toxic, right? That has much more difficult rules. That is not so comfortable as the gallery space or some biennial pavilion and so on, right? So because otherwise, at the same time, I mean, it's again like mirroring my personal also experience of the recent months. Sorry, yeah, just to wrap it up, of the recent months when you know, I mean. Institutionally speaking, we have been collaborating with so many partners, institutions in the West and elsewhere, like who have always been claiming like that they are super radical, they are radical in political involvement, they, you know, this kind of radical chic, right? That they are so just beyond any horizon. At the same time, when Realpolitik arrived, they just, instead of all this claimed radicality, they simply resorted to a kind of white cube humanitarianism, helping refugees. Of course, this is super important and valuable, but at the same time, I mean, they were not even ready to disturb their publics and their authorities, perhaps they are dependent on, right? In order to change the status quo, not only in the art field, but also outside, in their own respective context, in order to make this war, for instance, to stop, right? So that's why I think that this, so I'm definitely for this institutional development, but at the same time I think that it has to be really revised and reapproached accordingly. And since you are from the Netherlands, I just also came to my mind that isn't it strange, right, that already like for like 2015, right, that that in this war such distant countries as Ukraine and the Netherlands have common victims in this war. I mean, of course, MH17 flight. This is really strange, right? But at the same time, it also shows the scale of what has been going on. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So I guess, thank you, Vasyl. So I think it's...
pleasure is my side, yeah.
I think it takes your applause. Thank you very much. And I think your last comment gave a lot of food for thought for tomorrow's workshop, starting at 2 p.m. here at Truckle House. So I will kind of share my thoughts tomorrow then, and wishing you all a pleasant evening, or let's say rather a more kind of thoughtful evening after this lecture, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you for coming, and also please follow the program for those who are still online with us next week, where we have 3 events. We have a lecture with Angelo Plessas, we have a lecture intervention with Trace and with Tracy Rose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. It was too long, sorry.